Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm Paula Byrne, by the way, and I'm here I'm in conversation with Stephen Greenblatt. We just conferred, we write old-fashioned notes on pen and paper. And Stephen, he's so marvellous, I had to write it down because I can't do this from the top of my head. Stephen Greenblatt is the world's most renowned literary critic. He is the winner of the Pulitzer Prize, the National Book Award, and the Holberg Prize, which is the academic equivalent of the Nobel Prize. He is University Professor of the Humanities at Harvard, and he is the founder of New Historicism, which has shaped the study of Renaissance literature over the past 40 years. His numerous books include a biography of Shakespeare. There's too many books to mention, we'd be here all day. But most recently, and the book that we're here to talk about today, is this book, Tyrant, Shakespeare on Politics, in which certain resemblances are found between Shakespeare's despots and certain contemporary leaders. So, I'm going to start with the obvious question. Is this a book about Donald Trump?
It's a book that never mentions the T word, or Putin, or Bolsonaro, or Duterte, or Salvini, or the innumerable others that mark a change in our world. But obviously, their presence is felt as it is felt, I think, by many of us, even when we're not thinking directly about politics. So I made a decision early on not to mention the unmentionable.
Is that because you're worried about your visa? You might not get back in the borders.
No, actually, I mean, the interesting thing is that the choice is an interesting one of that kind because we can say anything we want. That's one of the things that is, if not secure, at least reasonably stable for all of us, that there's no reason to be coy. If I wanted to say, speak directly and say whatever I wish to say about any of these current leaders, you might have more difficulty in Saudi Arabia or a few other places. I mean, there are places in the world in which you can go into your embassy and not emerge alive. But that's not true, I think, thank heavens, for any of us. We can say what we want. But there can be reasons not to say it, not to make this a direct rant about current events.
Well, it's not a rant. I mean, it really is. It's such a beautifully written book, so accessible, and I think there's some incredible close readings. I'll come back to it later. But just before I leave Donald Trump, and I'll come back, I'm going to do another little thing because my son swears that 16 years ago, The Simpsons had an episode in which Trump was president. Yes. And is that right?
Is that right? True, yeah.
And it was, and there was a line that you used that really resonated. It says, and the creator of The Simpsons said, it was consistent with the vision of America going insane. And 16 years ago, you know, we laughed at that. And I think this is one of the things that particularly I want to talk quite a bit about Richard III, because I think your chapter on Richard III is completely stunning. That depiction of the villain. And the idea that, there's a lovely phrase that you use, and you say, nobody ever believes Richard III is going to get on this throne. They just don't believe it. They just look at him and think, eek. And it's a sort of unmentionable, it's never going to happen. And he uses that. How could this ever happen? How can Donald Trump be president? How can Boris be? I don't know, you know, whatever. You think it's unimaginable, and yet somehow it happens. So I will come back to that. But just before we leave that, of the various tyrants and villains that you write about in this marvellous book, which one is most relevant to the age of Trump? And then the T word is vaguely.
No, I don't mind speaking of the T word. In fact, I think it is the case that America's president often feels, and says he feels, that he doesn't get enough credit for the remarkable things that he has done and is doing. He's deeply resentful often of especially of the press and of people in universities for not giving him credit. And I think it is part of the spirit of my book to say that Donald Trump has done a great deal to make Shakespeare great again. Which is to say that there isn't a single figure that fits perfectly. Why would you expect a single figure to fit perfectly from a completely different culture 400 years ago? But there's a way in which many of these figures have a bearing, as they should, on our contemporary world and on this particular weird manifestation of our contemporary world. But that's to say that Shakespeare is powerfully relevant. Shakespeare's not great because he's relevant. Shakespeare's powerfully relevant because he's great. And the greatness is, in this case, as it's been for a very long time, because the works have an eerie way of illuminating the world that you're in. So this is the world we're in, and we can look here and find, to our surprise, strange resonances. Mm-hmm.
Is that a good moment for us to have our little reading?
Sure.
So it's, I did write the page numbers nice. It's slightly different with the American edition. Could we start with the Richard III
That
reading?
is fine. I have to find it, but it can't be that hard. Well, maybe it's harder than I think. Hang on a second.
It's right at the beginning of the chapter, isn't it?
Yeah.
I thought I'd written it down. Sorry. Inefficient.
Give me 1 second. I think I'm there. I'm almost there. I'm writing about and here too, I leave I think the name off for a little bit here. It's the beginning of a chapter. He's pathologically narcissistic and supremely arrogant. He has a grotesque sense of entitlement, never doubting that he can do whatever he chooses. He loves to bark orders and to watch underlings scurry to carry them out. He expects absolute loyalty, but he's incapable of gratitude. The feelings of others mean nothing to him. He has no natural grace, no sense of shared humanity, no decency. He's not merely indifferent to the law, he hates it and takes pleasure in breaking it. He hates it because it gets in his way and because it stands for a notion of public good that he holds in contempt. He divides the world into winners and losers. The winners arouse his regard insofar as he can use them for his own ends. The losers arouse only his scorn. The public good is something only losers like to talk about. What he likes to talk about is winning. He's always had wealth. He was born into it and makes ample use of it. But though he enjoys having what money can get him, it's not what most excites him. What excites him is the joy of domination. He is a bully. Easily enraged, he strikes out at anyone who stands in his way. He enjoys seeing others cringe, tremble, or wince with pain. He is gifted at detecting weakness and deft at mockery and insult. These skills attract followers who are drawn to the same cruel delight, even if they cannot have it to his unmatched degree. Though they know that he's dangerous, the followers help him advance to his goal, which is the possession of extreme power, of supreme power. His possession of power includes the domination of women, but he despises them far more than desires them. Sexual conquest excites him, but only for the endlessly reiterated proof that he can have anything he likes. He knows that those he grabs hate him. For that matter, once he succeeded in seizing the control that so attracts him in politics as in sex, he knows that virtually everyone hates him. At first, that knowledge energizes him, making him feverishly alert to rivals and conspiracies, but it soon begins to eat away at him and exhaust him. Sooner or later, he's brought down. He dies unloved and unlamented. He leaves behind only wreckage. It would have been better had Richard III never been born.
That's brilliant. So I wanted to have a reading to give you a sense of the brilliance of the psychological insights that Stephen provides. And it is a book about Shakespeare. Obviously, that resonates with some of our leaders today. I also thought, let's just talk about Richard III for a moment. His relationship with his mother, I thought you were really brilliant and incisive on his mother giving birth to this deformed creature that she has no maternal instinct for. He is born with teeth. And the way in which, and you talked a little bit about the self-hatred of Richard and dying lonely and lamented, but you write very powerfully about the mother-son relationship. And I think you say, apart from Hamlet and the obvious, there aren't many relationships in Shakespeare that really focus on the mother-son in quite some way. So could you talk a little bit about that?
It is strange, and I don't know how I feel about it, honestly, Paula. There's a certain way in which it's clear that Shakespeare, and he's borrowing it from Thomas More, from Thomas More's Life of Richard III, that Shakespeare was interested in how to explain this peculiar character. There's something probably problematical about thinking it. Look at the mother. There's a way in which Shakespeare depicts very quickly. It's a few quick brushstrokes in Richard III, and there's anticipation of it in Henry VI. That there's something wrong in his upbringing. It's an idea that Shakespeare comes back to, so it's not a one-off. He comes back to it in Coriolanus, of thinking that if you want to explain a certain kind of pathological character, you might think about what it was like, what the upbringing was like, and particularly what the relationship to the mother was like. One of my sons is a doctor and says that neonatal teeth are not that rare.
Really?
But it's responded to with horror and disgust by his mother. And
especially if you're breastfeeding.
Well, yes, that might be a little complicated. And but I believe that wet nurses took most of the burden of that off wealthy women. I think that the most interesting side of that, of that peculiar dyad, from my perspective, is the sense, and I do think this has resonance maybe now too. What accounts for a personality, the development of a personality that insists on getting into your head and won't ever go away? Because one of the interesting characteristics of Richard, and that does have, I think, peculiar presence for us now, is the idea of, I talked about this with Tina Brown once, of the brainworm, of these figures as they just get into your head and you can't get them out. I actually have to work almost daily to keep them out, not to pay attention. And Shakespeare oddly has an account, in effect, of how you would develop a personality of that kind that just wants to burrow into you and never leave you. And it has to do with being refused, in Shakespeare's account, maybe it's too simple, being refused entry, as it were, by your mother, not taken in by your mother as an infant, and you spend the rest of your life. But who knows? We have only the most peculiar indirect access to the past of someone like, the childhood of someone like Richard III, and it has a little bit of the, how should we say, Victorian Shakespeareans who tried to think about what the childhood of Ophelia was like or what the childhood of Hamlet was like. Who knows? We can make these just so stories up to explain how you would get someone who just won't go away.
And I think Iago is a bit like that, because I was thinking about your villains and thinking about Iago, who, a little plug for myself since I'm here, I've written a novel about Othello, an updated novel set in an Oxford college. But the thing about Iago as a villain, I was thinking about him in relation to how you write about Richard and your insights and your close reading of Richard, which is so fantastic. Iago does that. He gets inside Othello's head, and the more Othello doesn't want to think about Desdemona having an affair, the more he thinks about it. So he keeps, and he does that by repetition. So Cassio, 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 until he does have a sort of breakdown. Othello, he just doesn't want to think about it. But he's a different kind of villain, Iago. We get access to Iago's villainy in the soliloquy, and am I right? And in the same way as Richard. But I guess with Richard, because he is so physically repulsive, in a way that Iago, he's bluff and he's blunt, but he's not repulsive.
But it doesn't
charming.
depend on actually being repulsive. It depends on feeling repulsive. And actually in that regard, Iago is in the same
He's in the same
world. Like Iago says about Cassio, that he has a beauty that makes me feel ugly. I mean, so there is some odd way in which feeling ugly, it certainly is, it doesn't have anything to do with the way you actually look, I think. I mean, but feeling ugly is at least one possible, but maybe thin explanation. Because for Shakespeare, it's not only character. However, he's interested in character. It's also what kind of world you're in, what situation, who's vulnerable to you, who will go along with you. The world is full of, I'm sorry to say, disagreeable people. But the question is, do they become your leaders? And under what circumstances does that happen? And that is the question that Shakespeare asks repeatedly in his career. How does it happen that a whole culture with its protections and norms falls into the hands of catastrophic people? It is actually a question that does concentrate the mind on occasion. I'm
going to just seg into that because one of the chapters in Stephen's book is called Enablers, and it's a depiction, well, it's an account, an analysis, an exploration of how does that happen? How did Hitler get into power? How did that happen? Who are the enablers? How does a society do that? So there's some questions that I'm just going to throw out. Your book asks, how is it possible for a whole country to fall into the hands of a tyrant? Why do large numbers of people knowingly accept being lied to? What are the psychological mechanisms that lead a nation to abandon its ideals? And I think they are the questions that you raise and attempt to answer. How do you think Shakespeare is attempting to answer some of those questions?
It was, in general, of course, not just Shakespeare alone, a question, and not just the English Renaissance alone, that floats around especially in difficult times. How does this happen? Etienne La Boétie, who was Montaigne's friend, came up with a somewhat fantastic notion of how you'd escape such a world. He wrote a book called Against Tyrants, a book called The Contre Un. And he says that, well, just don't bring him his coffee in the morning. He doesn't say coffee, but I mean, he asks for something. You don't have to have a rebellion. Just don't listen. Don't do. All you need is enough people simply not paying attention to the orders, because it's just one person. But that's only the flip side of the beginnings of a kind of understanding, which is that it takes a village, as it were. It takes a whole system to get someone actually, particularly someone whom everyone perceives is inappropriate, to go along with this. And Shakespeare is fascinated by the mechanisms that lead large numbers of people to go along and to enable. I mean, in Etienne La Boétie's case, Montaigne's friend's case, he thought that it was a kind of pyramid scheme in which you needed 10 people who felt that they could get something or were dependent on the one person, and then each of those people had 10 people, and each of those people had 10 people, and eventually you got an enormous number of people who felt somehow it was in their interest to go along with this thing. Shakespeare has a, I think, rather more nuanced account of the range of reasons that people will, what appears to be, violate their own interests. And part of the brilliance of the plays, he gives them names. They're called Buckingham, Hastings, and Catesby, and so forth. But each of them, and has, as usual with Shakespeare, a kind of individual vividness about them. But it's not the individual vividness alone. It's a sense of who they are in a larger scheme, why they think that this is in their interests to support, in this case, someone they perceive as a horrible character and completely inappropriate to be the ruler of the country, but they enable them to be there.
They do. And there are different groups, because I think you say, am I right in saying that you say there's a group of enablers who really believe everything's just going to be okay because there's enough adults in the room to make it okay.
Yes.
And then suddenly, it's too late.
There's a significant number of people of different kinds who think, for one reason or another, that the norms are going to hold. I mean, in Richard, the case of, as they say, Shakespeare varies this in different plays, but in the case of Richard III, the Queen's brothers clearly think that the norms are going to hold. Hastings thinks that the norms are going to hold. It's actually, it doesn't have to be written down as a law. You think that the ordinary ways in which human beings normally deal with each other have enough tensile strength to keep everything going until they no longer do have anything that keeps anything going. One of the things that's been astonishing in my lifetime, and in the last few years, really, but not only in the last administration, is the things that I assumed. I even thought they were laws, but they're not laws. They were assumptions about how our society is organized. Habeas corpus, for example, I thought our laws would keep anyone from being seized and held without trial in peculiar prisons, extraterritorial prisons, as it were. But it turns out, no, this was a norm in our culture, and a collective understanding that it couldn't happen otherwise. But that's not true. And I think, I mean, in Britain, because you have an unwritten constitution, you have even more of that, that sense that there's enough strength in the long-term understanding, mutual understanding, that the norms will hold, and God willing, they'll hold, but they don't always. And we're living through a time, not just in our countries, but I think in the world, in which we're experimenting with how much they'll hold. And Shakespeare's fascinated by how quickly they, of course, he's a dramatist, so it's fun to think how quickly they can suddenly disappear, and you look around and you're in a world with no protection at all, as Richard's brother
and even
Clarence
I was just
learns
going to
at
say
the
the familial bonds.
Yeah.
So Clarence thinks, okay, I know he's pretty awful, but he's still my brother.
Yeah.
And still persists in believing that his own brother will not want to dispose of him.
When the murderers come, he says, just ring up my brother. I mean, the murderers laugh. Yeah.
I know, and you were absolutely brilliant. Going back to the villain, I mean, time for a little bit about Macbeth as well, and your reading of Macbeth as a villain who really doesn't want to be a villain, or at least that's how I read your portrayal of Macbeth, and the way that he's emasculated by his wife. Is that a fair, reading of your...
Emasculated might not be the right term, something like the opposite. He's given his masculinity entirely by his wife. It's his not acting where she threatens him. Again, like other thing we were talking about. I'm sensitive now, teaching in a world in which that's the good side of the world that I teach in now, is that I think, be made more sensitive to what are the implications of this. For example, for imagining that it's the woman's fault here, the wife's fault. At least as Shakespeare depicts it, Macbeth, at the beginning of the play, doesn't want, he's tempted, he's interested and excited, but he doesn't want to go ahead. But his wife sexually teases him, in effect, into taking the fatal step. So not emasculates, but masculinizes, as it were, says if you had enough testosterone, this is what you would be doing.
But I was thinking again, and also the familial bonds as well, because I was very struck. I love the little details in your book when Macbeth doesn't want to kill someone in his own home. It's like he doesn't really mind if it's somewhere else.
Yes.
But, that's a bit yuck. I can't really do it in my own home.
Yes.
And I suppose, do you think Shakespeare, because his hero, his villains are royal villains, aren't they? Iago being probably the exception to that rule. But what he does, which I think is so magnificent, is he makes us feel that we understand them as people. King Lear, it's a family drama. I should say, who in their right minds would divide the kingdom between 3 daughters? Who would do that? Yes. But you see divided families all the time. I like that reading. Have you had that reading that Cordelia might be from a different... because he's 80, that she's probably a step-sibling. I love all these readings that come up. But what do you think about...
I mean, I think that, first of all, it is the case. It's a little bit like our earlier conversation about the norms. In the case of Macbeth, it's not just that you don't want to get blood on your rug, as it were. It's also that you're under the deepest normative obligation as a host to a guest. That is to say, it's an extreme version of the thing we were talking about. What does it mean to actually attack your guest? And he's also a thane in relation to his lord and so forth. There are many levels of obligation that are violated in a single act. And that there is a sense, likewise, I mean, of family being involved, because you may remember Lady Macbeth says that she would have done the deed had he not looked so much like her father. So as always, as you're absolutely right in Shakespeare, you feel the presence of family even in the most formal of circumstances, and Lear is the extreme instance of this, where I think in the case of Lear, maybe this is just because of the point I am in my own life. My youngest son just graduated from high school, and that marks a kind of moment in our culture in which you're a certain way of being a parent and it comes to an end, formally an end, though they come back and stay with you from time to time. But Lear begins not accidentally at the moment at which his youngest daughter is about to be married off, either to France or Burgundy. And that is the moment at which, in Shakespeare's world, to some extent in the world also of evolutionary biology, the age in which your youngest child reaches his or her reproductive moment, it means, especially if you're a male, that your role in life is over. There's a way we can justify, this is going off script, there's a way in which we can justify postmenopausal women surviving. The surprise is for human beings, humans are the only primates in which women survive after menopause. And so that's a question of why. And the general answer given is that actually enables humans, as opposed to all other primates, to have many offspring, stack their offspring, because you actually need grandmothers. But there's no comparable explanation for men. They're worthless after the youngest child is ready to leave. And Lear has an enormously powerful version of that. He's going to crawl toward death, he says, at the beginning. He knows this is the moment at which his role is over, and that all he wants, that's one of the things that's so unbearably painful about the play, all he wants is some enactment of, as if for the last time, of the infantile dependence, that the thrill that little infants give you when they want you, need you. So he wants his adult children to do the thing one more time, and the miserable Cordelia refuses to do it. And the whole system begins to crumble.
And the sort of power without responsibility. And just when you were saying that, it reminded me of that terrible moment in Richard III when he seduces Queen Anne, which I still cannot get my head around at all. I mean, I can't understand it, I can't explain. But then when he wants to marry the daughter of the man he's killed, and he says, it's fine because you can have grandchildren.
Yes.
And you just think, what kind of, this is a really strange world we're living in.
Yes. It's horrible. It's his most perverse and, perverted moment in the play, when he proposes that he's going to plant the children he's killed inside the womb of his daughter. Whoa! Again, I said I wasn't going to do this. I wasn't going to mention our current leader, but I had a moment of this. I really keep it out, but I had a moment of remembering that scene in Richard III when there was a very unpleasant photograph that was published on the front page of our papers after the El Paso massacre, and the El Paso massacre was basically absolutely, certainly incited by the rhetoric that was used. These people are murderers and rapists. They're invading our country. We have to keep them out. I mean, that's, I know you don't have leaders who are irresponsible in what they say, but this was a shocking rhetoric, repeated multiple times, and it licensed the crazy person to go and shoot and kill a bunch of people, Hispanics in El Paso. And then there was a photograph there were two of the people who were killed were parents who were shielding with their bodies their infant. The parents were killed. The infant survived. And there's an astonishing photograph of the infant being held by Melania Trump. And Donald Trump has a huge smile on his face, and he's got his thumb up. So I thought, who does that? Who is so unaware of the circumstances that he's in, that they're holding the baby that survives from the parents who've been murdered on your, well, you must not think it's somehow related to any of his words. So the moment at which some kind of political story tips into something sociopathic, to me inexplicable, and terrifying. And then you hope that your culture will think, no, we really, this is not acceptable. We can't. There's a wide spectrum of political positions we can take in the world, but that is not a political position. That's a form of sociopathy, and it's not acceptable. But we'll see.
And Richard III comes.
Richard III at that point goes way over.
Way over.
And in that scene, Elizabeth actually gives a non-committal answer, presumably goes off and vomits in the other room, but then makes sure that she's going to protect her daughter.
Her daughter. But people are frightened, and I think going back to the enablers and the people around the despot that allows it to happen, you're very good at drawing, and particularly in Shakespeare's world, in the courtly world, and you talk a lot about Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth, and how she controls the court, and she's getting much older now, and she's losing some of her faithful people, and you talk brilliantly about the Essex Rebellion. Can you talk a little bit about, and John Cade as well? Should we have that little reading? I think the John Cade reading, do we?
Do we have time?
Are we over? Yeah,
you tell me.
We do.
Well, I'm interested in if we can come back to the question of Elizabeth, I'm interested in whether whether recognizing that your leader is lying to you is a disabling part of politics. And one of the things that Shakespeare is interested in repeatedly in the plays, not only in the early history plays, but here very vividly, is the surprising perception that everyone knows it's a lie. And that turns out not to be, actually in certain circumstances, not to be politically problematical at all. So this is you will recognize the character, I think, probably Jack Cade. The mob gathering just outside London in Blackheath is rallied by Cade, who proves himself to be an effective demagogue, the master of voodoo economics. I have a quote from the play. This is from Henry VI, Part 2. There shall be in England 7 halfpenny loaves sold for a penny. I can't do the accent as all of you would be able to do. The 3-ooped pot, I can't do it. She'll have 10 oops, and so forth. When the crowd roars its approval, Cade sounds exactly like a modern stump speaker. I thank you, good people. The absurdity of these campaign promises is not an impediment to their effectiveness. On the contrary, Cade keeps producing demonstrable falsehoods about his origins and making wild claims about the great things he will do, and the crowds eagerly swallow them. To be sure, his neighbors know that Cade is a congenital liar. I have a few quotes. Cade, my mother a Plantagenet. The butcher who says, I knew her well, she was a midwife. Cade says, my wife descended of the Lacys. Butcher says, yeah, she was indeed a peddler's daughter and sold laces. So forth. A lot of slightly dumb jokes of this kind. Cade's absurd assertions of aristocratic lineage should make him seem merely a buffoon. Far from a wealthy, high-born magnate, he's little more than a vagabond. But strangely enough, though everyone knows this, this knowledge does not diminish the mob's faith. In ordinary times, when a public figure is caught in a lie or simply reveals blatant ignorance of the truth, his standing is diminished, but these are not ordinary times. If a dispassionate bystander were to point out all of Cade's grotesque distortions, mistakes, and downright lies, the crowd's anger would light on the skeptic and not on Cade. Famously, it's at the end of one of Cade's speeches that someone in the crowd shouts, this is the line you'll all know from that rather obscure early play, "The first thing we do, let's kill all the lawyers." Shakespeare knew that the line would get laughs, as it's done for the last 4 centuries. It releases the current of aggression that swirls around the whole enterprise of the law. We blithely imagine that the crowd wants responsible qualities in its leaders, but the scene suggests otherwise. What it wants is permission to ignore commitments, to violate promises, and to break the rules. And I mean, I could go on, but I think the general picture is one that, again, interests Shakespeare. How does populism, the kind he's exploring, work? It doesn't work by concealing its lies. It works actually by bringing people in to the pleasure of the peculiar pleasure of that, of course, Shakespeare understood profoundly as a playwright. It was his business of the suspension of the truth, the entering into a fictional world, and the deliciousness of living in a fictional world you know is fictional for as long as the party will go on.
But he's living in a dangerous world, Shakespeare, as well. And I think you're brilliant at bringing out that it's dangerous to put on political theatre. And so, in one sense, he's writing about these kings and queens from the history plays at once removed, yes, in order to talk about the politics of the day.
It could have been incredibly dangerous. And it was for several of Shakespeare's contemporaries. But Shakespeare was actually remarkably good at staying out of jail. And in ways that are actually a little difficult to, even with everything one knows, a little difficult to understand how he succeeded, because this is someone who, in 1601, I think it's 1601, a Benedictine, a Welsh Benedictine, was executed, and in the unspeakable way that these things were done, for treason. And when the executioner severed his head and raised it up after torturing him and so forth and so on, he shouted, actually, I'm sorry, this would have been 1605, I think. He shouted, "God save the king," and there was total silence. And that the silence was reported, that was ominous, but it was clear what the crowd was thinking in the silence. The silence spoke, but if anyone said anything, they would immediately have been brutally punished. But Shakespeare has a character stand up in a play and say, when the king says, "I'll have you burned," she says, "I care not. It's a heretic that makes the fire, not she which burns in it. It's a heretic that makes the fire." Now, if anyone said such a thing openly in the late 16th, early 17th century, that's absolute high treason. You're dead. But Shakespeare has a character say it before several thousand people on a cheerful afternoon, and nothing happens. And it's because for a crucial reason, I mean, because there's a kind of aesthetic screen, an aesthetic screen that says none of this is real, none of this is important, none of this actually tells on our real political circumstances. So we can have a character get up and say, "A dog's obeyed in office." And that's something, if you say in the local pub, you get your tongue bored through, but you can say it before thousands of people. And so the question is how to keep the aesthetic screen from being torn. And Shakespeare is actually very cunning at figuring out how to do that, and it's actually a crucial principle for art in hard times. As they say, this is not our particular worry, but it's the work of artists in the Soviet Union, it's the work of artists in Saudi Arabia or Iran. Now it was certainly Shakespeare is writing basically in Saudi Arabia and understood that those were the rules, and he figures out how to do what he needs to do, what everyone needs to do, because actually it's like Midas's wife. You can't live without some expression of the reality that you're living in. Somewhere you have to whisper it in the reeds. And Shakespeare finds a way of, as it were, shouting it in the reeds, but without tearing the aesthetic screen. If it's torn, you're dead. And that's the game that he played, and he played unbelievably well.
You say that we like a villain. We do like a villain. And there's a point in the book when you say, in a sense, the theatre audience are complicit. Could you talk a little bit about what do you mean when you say?
Well, certainly, Shakespeare is complex about this. He's complex about everything. But there's a way in which we love, in the case of, it's a play about very good people who behave well would be unbearable. So Shakespeare is very good at getting us excited by and having us take various forms of delicious identification with monsters. And he also is interesting and good at enabling us to come to terms, or at least forcing us to come to terms, with our peculiar propensity to do that. He does it repeatedly, and making you feel, making you aware of the level of your complicity. I think he was interested in doing it partly as a kind of, this will sound Victorian on my part, but so be it, as a kind of moral education for his audience. But I think he's also interested in doing it because he knows that that's his business. That's what he's doing. He's manipulating crowds. He has, to a supreme degree, many of the skills that he attributes to his most terrifying characters. And it's not just the characters like Richard, it's characters like Aaron the Moor or Iago, who are playwrights, in effect. And Shakespeare understands the extent to which he is involved in something like, morally involved in a very complex act of manipulating crowd
and rhetoric. And I think that's right. And I think because these people are capable of powerful, beautiful language. Even Iago, at his most ugly, speaks so beautifully. He's just so eloquent. And I don't think, I know we can't keep mentioning the T word, but eloquence is not something I would necessarily associate with that leadership. And we're having our own issues with Boris at the moment. All hail, Lady Hail. Get our spider brooches out. But the rhetoric, and I think there's a point in your book when you talk about, there's a speech that Macbeth makes that you say Shakespeare writing Richard III would not have made then, because he's growing as a playwright. And it seems to me there is something about that the ability to manipulate language. And again, Iago is just so good at that when he says, I'm going to make you not all poppies nor mandragora. He says, I'm going to get right inside your head. And the thing about Iago is he doesn't want power. All of these other people, it seems to me, get something out of it. They're getting power. And then they're terrified. They're going to lose it, and they don't know who to trust. And they're looking, do I trust this person? Do I trust Buckingham? What about Hastings? Let's get rid of him. Let's get rid of him. And then they become isolated and lonely. Iago is so different because he just wants to destroy for the sake of it. And I think by that stage, something very different is happening with Shakespeare. And although he keeps saying Othello's so eloquent, he's so marvellous, the person I think that is really eloquent is the villain.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think what's interesting about, I thought of this before, but I think what's interesting about Iago in the terms that you're describing is that it's not actually principally done by grand, beautiful rhetoric. Shakespeare is interested in that phenomenon. I mean, maybe most famously in Julius Caesar, where he sets up a situation in which Brutus gives a perfectly marvelous speech, but then Shakespeare shows you what a really marvelous speech will be in Antony. That's a fantastic tour de force. In the case of Iago, it's done with the word indeed. Basta, finito. Indeed, that's enough. And then it's done through manipulating, and the reason it's interesting, it's done by manipulating what Othello sees or thinks he sees. And the reason that's, I think, worth saying, one always likes to, since I adore Shakespeare, I always want to attribute to him infinite awareness of what was to come in hundreds of years. So I want to say in our culture, as you started by saying, it actually, that level of rhetorical genius no longer seems to matter. What matters is manipulating visual signs. Our cultures become the kind of awareness that the late 16th, 17th century audiences had to verbal manipulations, and it helped to go to listen to 2 or 3 hour sermons once a week written by people like John Donne, I mean, with unbelievable complexity, so that people had a kind of almost insanely developed sense of listening to complex rhetoric. We have only visually, actually. I mean, if I think about my own children or my students, they're unbelievably clever at processing very complex visual signs, and much less so at processing complex rhetorical signs. But it's as if in Othello, Shakespeare thought, well, you could do it without grandiose rhetoric. You could do it just by saying, stand over here and just look there, and then you.
But that's part of Iago. Iago is presenting an image of, I'm a bluff soldier. I just say it as it is. I'm just going to keep the language simple. But then he has his soliloquies in which the more he tries to tell us and justify why he's doing this terrible thing.
Figure out what the hell it is.
And those soliloquies are deeply beautiful and elegant and rhetorical. And we feel more and more confused because we think, are you convincing yourself? Because you're not convincing us. So it's like he's searching for this reason. I just want to destroy this
The
marriage.
weird thing about that, Paula, and maybe you wouldn't understand it, I don't understand it, is that at a certain point it doesn't seem to have any motive at all. That is to say, at first he says he's resentful that Cassio has got the job that he wants to get. Then he gets the job, and he doesn't stop. So he's working for Othello. His wife is working for Mrs. Othello. They've got a family business together, serving the Othellos. If he destroys Othello and his wife, he's out of work. And he keeps going. So that is a very strange and totally unexplained.
And it's not power. The other thing I just quickly, my epigraph
to
my novel is, without the tweets, I wouldn't be here. Donald J. Trump, 45th President of the United States of America. And again, just maybe because I'll need to open up for questions, but this is a president that seemed to win his power through tweeting. And just very slightly pick up on what you were saying about your students and language and the way in which the digital world has changed. And I think about those people like JFK who were educated and eloquent. And it seems to me the lack of eloquence is serving him well. Mm-hmm. Would you?
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, but I think it behooves us. I mean, putting our current situation aside, I mean, what of this person or that person, it behooves us to be as alert to the manipulation of our media, including visual signs, as it was in the late 16th, early 17th century, to be alert to the manipulation of verbal signs. That's what it means to be a citizen in our world, is to try to make oneself aware of the ways in which we're being used, manipulated, and if it turns out that that's through, at least through our digital media and through the visual, that's our work as responsible people, to try to figure out how to maintain our freedom and the rule of reason, and to resist being duped. Shakespeare is not living in our world. He's living in a completely different culture with a different set of rules. He's very good, putting it mildly, at burrowing in and understanding how those rules work and how they can be twisted for nefarious ends. And we have the same obligation, and we can do some of the work through, I think, or at least I argue in this book, that it's actually helpful sometimes to look away from the particular thing that we're obsessed with, and to look obliquely, look back in the past, take some kind of distance from the circumstance. But then we also have to plunge in to our own circumstances.
That sounds a really good moment for you to take some questions. There's 2 microphones, so if you put your hand up and we can bring the mic to you. So there's a young woman at the front here.
Thank you so much for the talk. I was just wondering how you feel literary criticism can practically help us with the climate crisis. So similar to tyrants, but slightly different.
I mean, I've thought about this.
Did you all hear that, by the way?
How it can help us with the climate crisis, and it's a deep and important question. I feel since I flew here, I feel in a rather false position answering that question. I do think that, and there are people, of course, as we know, who have made it a commitment profoundly to, in a personal and powerful way, to reduce their carbon footprint, to actually be sensitive in a daily way to this. I think that's great, and I think that literary criticism is, as it is in relation to the political matters that I'm talking about, one very, very small piece of a huge collective social effort. I mean, so I don't make grand claims for what literary criticism can do, but I do think that literature, it's putting literary criticism aside for the moment, I'll come back to it, but that literature over a very long period of time has been unusually sensitive to and alert to the relationship of humans to the natural world. And that the one thing that is happening at the moment is that the very technological means that have enabled us as a species to do astonishing things over the last 150 years, let's say, are, and maybe a little bit longer than 150 years, are causing terrifying damage. And that being alert to a very long-term, quite different relationship of our literature to the natural world, the literature that has been, that is not the product of the Industrial Revolution and technology, but actually from Romanticism back has had a different relationship with the natural world, is one small piece of a reorienting of ourselves toward our relationship as a species to the natural world that we're probably severely in need of. I say that, as I say, somewhat sheepishly, because, as I say, I'm aware of the extent to which my very being here and is already a kind of undoing of the very thing that I want to say that we can do. But I believe that, and of course there are people, many people in the literary critical world now who are going back into our, not only into the verbal traces into literature, but also into the visual and spiritual world to try to rethink our relationship to the natural world. And even to put it that way is wrong, to re-immerse us, to make us understand that we're not separate from this thing. So it's not that we have a relationship, we are that thing, and we're a piece of it, and we're a dysfunctional piece of it at the moment that needs to be, if we can, if it's not too late, resituated in our world.
Thank you for being brave enough to ask the first question. Anybody else? Tina?
Thank you.
I'll come back to you.
Such a wonderful book. You talk about how in other times the norms that Richard violates might cause outrage, but these, you say, are not ordinary times. So what are the factors that seed the not ordinary times? What are the sort of socioeconomic kind of marsh in which the tyrant rises?
Yes, a wonderful question. And I mean, Shakespeare has different accounts and different plays of what it is, but one thing that is fairly consistent that goes from Henry VI at the very beginning of his career as a writer to Coriolanus at near the very end of his career as a writer is a large number of people who feel that they are not sharing in whatever goods, especially material goods, but not only those, are in their world. So I think it's not accidental in exactly this regard that we looked at the little scene for a second in Henry VI that Henry VI stages a moment at which the populist can be at work precisely because there's a large number of people who feel they don't have any stake in this system. It's not representing them. They're not getting anything from it, and they're willing to listen to someone who's actually doesn't have their interest in mind, but they're excited by it because they, in an inchoate way, feel that they're being screwed. And that's exactly the situation that Shakespeare begins Coriolanus with.
And the Third Reich and the rise of Hitler is precisely because so many people felt they didn't have a voice, they didn't have enough to eat. So he was able to use those circumstances for that heady rise.
So it's not the only explanation, but some sense of a huge discrepancy between, if only a psychological discrepancy between those who are in and those who are out seems to be one of the things that Shakespeare thought would enable something like this to happen.
There was a question. Yes. Do you need the mic, or do you want? Can we have a microphone?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. It's been so interesting. I wondered if you felt that Shakespeare had a message for us about tyranny in terms of its longevity. We talked about Macbeth and the tyrant of Scotland, and whether it could be argued because of his hubris he came to his end, or was Shakespeare saying there's hope, basically, what comes out of tyranny?
Yes. I mean, I think that on the whole, Shakespeare is not entirely cheerful, let's put it that way. That is to say, he sees the outcome again and again. I mean, he thinks it's going to come to an end. He doesn't think it's going to go on forever, but very often he thinks it's going to come to an end by social breakdown and civil war that will subsequently, eventually end in the downfall of the tyrant. Now, that's even there, he has some sense that there's some mitigating circumstances, including just the remarkable moments in Lear, which has a catastrophic end of all of this, but that in moments in which the nameless servant comes forward and stops the torturer from trying to torture Gloucester. And actually stands up against his own master, or the servants who come forward after the torture and try to give some medical assistance to the tortured person and so forth. But still, that's not, how should we say, cheerful or optimistic. I think that the moments of optimism in Shakespeare, if that's the right word for it, or the message of hope, surprisingly enough, are not the grand acts. I mean, I was very struck by last summer. I think it was last summer, I went to see the Shakespeare in the Park version of Julius Caesar in New York that Oscar Eustis and the Public Theater staged. And it was staged with a Trump lookalike being Julius Caesar. And a group of enraged, largely black women as the conspirators. And it caused a huge ruckus. Because there were people on the right said that this was Breitbart and so forth that said we're watching the assassination of the president, this is encouraging the assassination and so forth. And there were protests. There was one very strange night, my wife Amy and I and our son were there, in which the right paid people offered, I think the story was $1,000 to protest. And someone rushed the stage and said, this is violence against the right, and then